Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1899, when Missouri was still recovering from the economic depression that had gripped the nation for years, the residents of Holt County began to speak in hushed tones about the Blackwood estate. Situated on the outskirts of Mound City, perched atop a small hill overlooking the Missouri River, the mansion had stood for nearly 40 years, a testament to wealth accumulated through means that locals had long questioned. The property sat on 15 acres of land, most of it wooded, with a winding gravel path that led visitors through a corridor of ancient oak trees before revealing the imposing three-story Victorian structure that dominated the landscape. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't just what allegedly happened within those walls, but how the documentation surrounding the events was systematically destroyed, altered, or simply vanished over the subsequent decades. According to county records that survived until 1962, when a courthouse fire claimed many historical documents, the mansion was built in 1860 by Edmund Blackwood, a businessman who had made his fortune in railroad investments before the Civil War. The timing was peculiar, constructing such an opulent residence just as the nation was about to tear itself apart through conflict. Records from the First Bank of St. These financial irregularities, noted by bank manager Walter Pierce in his private correspondence from 1861, suggested that considerable funds were directed toward acquisitions not detailed in the official ledgers. Pierce's letters, discovered in his granddaughter's attic in 1947, express concern about Blackwood's unusual inquiries regarding the preservation of organic materials in construction. By 1899, the mansion had passed to Edmund's nephew, Thaddeus Blackwood, a reclusive figure who rarely ventured into town. Joseph indicate that Edmund withdrew substantial sums in the months leading up to the mansion's construction, far more than what conventional building costs would have justified, even for a residence of such grandeur. When he did, witnesses described him as uncommonly tall and thin, with a face that seemed perpetually shadowed, even in direct sunlight. Thaddeus had inherited the property following the mysterious disappearance of Edmund's only son Richard in 1891, a case that was never resolved despite a cursory investigation by the county sheriff. The official report, filed by then-Sheriff Thomas Murray, contains the curious notation that Richard's personal effects remained in his bedroom, arranged as though he intended to return momentarily, yet his bed showed signs of having been soaked through with an unidentified fluid that had stained the mattress a deep amber color. Town records indicate that the Blackwood family had always maintained a certain distance from local society. Edmund himself was described in contemporary accounts as scholarly to the point of obsession, with interests that extended beyond conventional engineering into what one associate called the murky territory between modern science and ancient superstition. A letter from Edmund to a colleague at Washington University, dated 1859, inquires about the theoretical limits of cellular adaptation when exposed to foreign structural compounds, a question that would seem more at home in modern biological research than 19th-century correspondence. What drew the attention of authorities to the mansion in late October 1899 wasn't initially connected to any suspicion of wrongdoing, but rather a series of unusual complaints from neighboring properties. 3 separate landowners reported hearing mechanical groaning emanating from the direction of the Blackwood estate during the night hours. One witness, Jonathan Mercer, whose farm bordered the southern edge of the property, provided a sworn statement to Sheriff William Donovan on October 27th. "It ain't like any sound I've heard in my 58 years, Mercer stated. Not animal, not machine exactly. It's as if the very ground is shifting, like something massive moving under strain. My wife won't sleep on that side of the house no more. Even the livestock seems affected. Chickens won't lay, and the milk cow dried up 3 weeks before her time. Sheriff Donovan, by all accounts a practical man, not given to superstition, initially dismissed the complaints as the natural settling of an aging structure, perhaps amplified by the crisp autumn air. The mansion was, after all, approaching its 4th decade, old enough for the wood to contract and expand with temperature changes, creating sounds that might carry across the open fields. His personal journal, however, later recovered from his office following his retirement in 1907, tells a different story. An entry dated October 28th reads, "Visited Mercer Farm today. Man isn't prone to fanciful thinking. While standing at the property line facing the Blackwood place, heard distinct sound myself. Low, sustained vibration, more felt than heard. Reminds me of the time I stood too close to a steam engine's boiler." This explanation might have sufficed had the reports not been accompanied by another peculiar detail. Several residents of Mound City claim to have observed lights moving within the mansion at unusual hours, following patterns that seemed to defy explanation. The lights would appear first in the east wing, then simultaneously in the west, without enough time for a person to have traversed the considerable distance between them. Howard Jenkins, the night watchman for Mound City's small business district, submitted a detailed log of these illuminations over a 3-week period in October. His observations, precise and methodical, note that the lights followed increasingly complex patterns, as though testing the limits of their mobility, he wrote on October 24th. Thaddeus Blackwood, when questioned about these occurrences, reportedly became agitated. According to the sheriff's notes, recovered from his personal effects after his death, Blackwood insisted that he lived alone in the mansion and suggested that any unusual sights or sounds were merely the product of provincial imaginations looking for diversion in a town devoid of proper entertainment. When pressed specifically about the lights, Thaddeus offered a curt explanation about experimental electrical fixtures he was installing, a curious claim given that electrical service had not yet been extended to the outlying areas of Holt County. The article written by editor Thomas Whitley described how Sheriff Donovan, accompanied by his deputy James Foster, returned to the Blackwood estate on the evening of October 31st, not, as might be assumed, due to the superstitious significance of the date, but because 3 additional reports had come in regarding the strange sounds, now described as rhythmic and deliberate. The newspaper account is factual in tone, but contains a curious paragraph that has drawn the attention of researchers who later examined the case. Sheriff Donovan reported that, upon approaching the main entrance, both men observed what appeared to be condensation forming on the exterior stonework of the mansion, despite the unseasonably warm evening. What happened next would be documented in the November 2nd, 1899 edition of the Mound City News-Independent, a small weekly publication that served the county. The moisture seemed to collect and run in channels that, according to Deputy Foster, moved against gravity itself, flowing upward rather than down. A footnote to this article, added by Whitley in the newspaper's bound archives but never published, indicates that he personally visited the site the following morning to verify these claims. His private notes state that the stone remained unnaturally damp to the touch, with an oily residue that clung to my fingers and required significant scrubbing to remove. Whitley further observed that the ground immediately surrounding the mansion appeared disturbed as though recently tilled, though no gardening tools were in evidence. What transpired during the sheriff's visit would become the first officially documented incident in what local residents would later refer to simply as the Blackwood Matter. According to both men's statements, preserved in county records until their disappearance in 1956, they were admitted to the mansion by Thaddeus himself, who appeared disheveled and uncomfortably damp, as though recently emerged from water. Deputy Foster's personal journal, more candid than the official report, notes that Thaddeus's clothing clung to his frame as if soaked through, yet left no moisture when he brushed against the door frame. Contradiction I cannot explain. The interior of the mansion, by their account, was immaculately maintained, yet strangely arranged. More unsettling was their observation that many chairs and tables appeared to have been secured to the floor with metal brackets, an unusual precaution that Thaddeus explained away as a measure against tremors from the nearby river bluffs. Sheriff Donovan, in his private notes, observed that the brackets appeared newly installed, with fresh scrape marks on the hardwood floors surrounding each piece, suggesting recent and hurried implementation. The deputies also noted the unusual temperature variations within the mansion. Certain rooms felt unnaturally cold, while others induced immediate perspiration. Most curious was Thaddeus's library, where both men reported experiencing a sensation akin to standing in a gentle current, though no windows were open. Deputy Foster's journal describes how papers on Thaddeus's desk fluttered continuously, as though disturbed by a breeze that could be felt, but not precisely located. Sheriff Donovan's report indicates that the two men conducted a cursory inspection of the ground floor, finding nothing immediately suspicious beyond the eccentric furnishing choices. Furniture had been positioned to create narrow pathways through rooms rather than functional living spaces. It was when they requested to see the upper floors that Thaddeus allegedly became visibly distressed, insisting that the upper chambers were undergoing renovations and were unsafe for visitors. When Sheriff Donovan pointed out that no construction materials were in evidence, nor had any workers been seen entering or leaving the property, Thaddeus reportedly replied, "The work is of a specialized nature requiring minimal external resources. The house provides most of what is needed." This cryptic statement might have prompted further inquiry had the visit not been interrupted by what both officials described as an unsettling occurrence. Foster's account states that as they stood in the main foyer discussing access to the upper floors, a distinct tremor passed through the structure, not the sharp jolt of an earthquake, but rather a slow, rolling motion, as though standing on the deck of a ship in gentle waters. This sensation was accompanied by what Deputy Foster characterized as a sound unlike any I have encountered, not mechanical, not animal, but possessed of both qualities. What might have ended as a routine visit took a disturbing turn when both men reported hearing what Deputy Foster described as a prolonged exhalation, as though the walls themselves were breathing out. Sheriff Donovan, more reserved in his description, noted only that a sustained vibration could be felt through the floorboards, accompanied by a sound not unlike air escaping a sealed chamber. Both men observed that during this phenomenon, the already secured furniture seemed to strain against its brackets, with several pieces audibly creaking from the pressure. Most unsettling was the behavior of the house's structure itself during this episode. According to Foster's private journal, the doorway we had entered through, which had stood open to provide a view of the front drive, slowly closed without human intervention, not with a slam or due to any draft, but gradually, inch by inch, as though pulled by an unseen hand. Donovan attempted to prevent this, placing his boot in the narrowing gap, only to withdraw quickly, claiming the door had exerted unexpected pressure against his foot. Thaddeus Blackwood's reaction to this phenomenon was perhaps the most telling detail in the official record. According to both witnesses, he showed no surprise but rather resignation, stating only, "She's restless tonight. You should leave before she fully wakes." When questioned about this statement, Thaddeus offered no clarification, but instead urged them toward the rear entrance with increasing urgency. Sheriff Donovan, in his personal notes, recorded that as they exited, Blackwood placed his palm flat against the wall beside the door, in a gesture one might use to calm a nervous horse, murmuring words too low to distinguish. The identity of she was not clarified in the initial report, though subsequent interviews with Donovan, conducted in 1902 for the Kansas City Star, suggest he believed Blackwood was referring to a woman possibly kept somewhere within the mansion. This theory would gain particular significance in light of what was discovered in December of that year. The reporter, Charles Granville, quoted Donovan as saying, "I considered at the time that Blackwood might have been harboring a woman against her will, perhaps a wife or companion whose existence was unknown to the community. This seemed the most rational explanation, though it failed to account for the unusual phenomena we experienced. The weeks following the sheriff's visit saw an increase in unusual reports connected to the Blackwood estate. Local physician Dr. Marcus Holloway documented 3 cases of patients suffering from identical nightmares featuring the mansion, despite having no connection to one another and, in one case, never having seen the property. These medical records, preserved in Dr. Holloway's personal journal, now housed in the Missouri Historical Society archives, describe dreams in which the mansion's walls pulsated like the chest of a sleeping giant. The most detailed account came from Eliza Thornton, a 42-year-old seamstress with no previous history of sleep disturbances, who reported dreaming that she stood in the mansion's foyer, watching as the wallpaper rippled and parted like skin, revealing a network of vessels beneath that pulsed with a dark fluid. Dr. Holloway noted that upon waking from this dream, Mrs. Thornton discovered her bed sheets soaked with perspiration that carried a faint amber tint, a detail that takes on particular significance when compared with the stains found on Richard Blackwood's abandoned mattress years earlier. More concrete were the observations of surveyor Edward Simmons, who had been contracted to map property boundaries in the county. His field notes from November 12, 1899, include a peculiar observation. Blackwood property lines show unexplained discrepancy from 1879 survey. Structure appears to occupy 3.8 feet more ground in all directions than original foundation plans indicate. Either previous measurements were erroneous or the building has somehow expanded. Simmons, a meticulous professional with 20 years' experience, checked his measurements 3 times before recording this finding, noting with evident confusion, foundation stones appear to have shifted outward from their original positions, though how this could occur without catastrophic structural failure is beyond my understanding. This seemingly impossible observation might have been dismissed as a simple error had it not been corroborated by an independent assessment conducted the following week by County Assessor Philip Gardner, who noted the same discrepancy and added, "Structure dimensions exceed original architectural plans filed with county by approximately 4 feet in each direction." Gardner's notes include the additional observation that the mansion's exterior stonework displayed unusual weathering patterns, not the expected erosion from top to bottom due to rainfall, but rather horizontal striations that suggest expansion and contraction, similar to growth rings in a tree. The most disturbing accounts from this period, however, came from those who reported passing the mansion at night. Marie Willoughby, a widow who lived approximately 1 mile east of the estate, provided a sworn statement to Sheriff Donovan on November 18th, claiming that while returning from visiting her sister in Mound City, she observed the entire eastern facade of the mansion ripple, as though it were a curtain disturbed by a breeze. Her testimony continues, "I know what I saw, though I wish daily that I hadn't. The wall moved like the flank of some great beast, and in that moment I swear on my departed husband's grave, a window on the 2nd floor, which I had clearly observed was rectangular in shape, slowly closed and reopened, like an eye blinking in the night." Mrs. Willoughby further stated that upon witnessing this, her horse refused to proceed, trembling violently and producing a high, keening sound, unlike any she had heard from the animal before. A similar account came from Benjamin Crawford, a railroad worker who passed the estate while walking home from his night shift. Crawford reported to Sheriff Donovan that he observed what appeared to be tendrils or root-like structures momentarily extending from the foundation stones before withdrawing back into the mortar. Crawford, described by associates as a sober and reliable man, not given to exaggeration, was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he refused to travel the same route again, adding nearly a mile to his daily commute to avoid proximity to the Blackwood property. Thaddeus Blackwood's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic, according to merchant ledgers from Mound City stores. His purchases, previously methodical and predictable, now included unusual quantities of salt, machine oil, and red cloth. On November 22nd, he ordered 300 pounds of salt from Garfield's General Store, an amount that proprietor Harold Garfield noted was enough to preserve meat for half the county through winter. When questioned about this purchase, Thaddeus reportedly explained that it was for structural maintenance rather than culinary purposes, a response that Garfield found bewildering but did not pursue. The apothecary records of William Hobbs indicate that during the same period, Thaddeus requested increasingly unusual items: potassium nitrate in significant quantities, sulfur, various mineral compounds, and what Hobbs described in his private notes as substances more commonly associated with medical research than household use. Most curious was Thaddeus's request for any text regarding the integration of disparate tissue types, which Hobbs could not fulfill but found sufficiently concerning to mention to Sheriff Donovan in passing. The most troubling record from this period is a partial letter discovered in the post office records during a historical review in 1951. The letter, never sent, but found among the personal effects of Postmaster Ellis Crawford after his death, appears to have been written by Thaddeus Blackwood and addressed to an unnamed recipient at Johns Hopkins University. The fragment that survived reads, "Can no longer deny the evidence before me. The integration has progressed beyond theoretical limits. The structure no longer merely houses it, but has become indistinguishable from it. I have observed actual cellular activity in samples taken from the east parlor wall, living tissue that, when viewed under magnification, appears neither fully organic nor entirely inorganic, but some impossible hybrid." Edmund's notes suggested this outcome, though I dismissed it as the ravings of a mind compromised by his experiments. I was wrong. The house is not merely alive, it is awakening to this fact itself. The salt provides temporary abatement, drawing moisture from the active regions and slowing the metabolic processes, but the effect diminishes with each application. The east wing has become particularly problematic. I have sealed it entirely after discovering that the door frames had constricted by approximately 1.7 inches overnight, nearly trapping me within. Most concerning is the development of what appear to be rudimentary sensory organs within the structure, areas of wall that react to proximity, light, and sound, with measurable changes in local temperature and density. I have considered abandoning the property, but fear what might occur should the structure be left to develop without inhibition. Moreover, I suspect it would not permit my departure at this stage. Twice now I have packed essential belongings only to find the front entrance sealed by what appears to be a calcareous growth indistinguishable from the surrounding stone, but formed overnight. I removed it with considerable effort, only to find it reformed by morning. If you receive this letter, I implore you to... The letter was never completed or sent, according to postal records. Several residents reported seeing Thaddeus in town that day, purchasing additional supplies and appearing, according to shopkeeper Martha Reynolds, gaunt and deeply fatigued, with a nervous demeanor entirely unlike his usual reserve. Reynolds noted in her personal diary that Thaddeus's clothing emitted a peculiar odor, not unwashed, but rather mineral, like the smell of a cave. She also observed what appeared to be a rash or irritation on his hands and wrists, with a distinctive pattern resembling fine lace or perhaps a network of small veins. What is documented with certainty is that at approximately 9:15 p.m. on that date, multiple residents of Mound City reported hearing what they described as an agonized wail coming from the direction of the Blackwood estate, a sound so distinct and disturbing that it prompted immediate action from Sheriff Donovan, who assembled a group of 4 men to investigate. Whether this was due to Thaddeus reconsidering his words, or because of what transpired on the night of November 25th, remains unknown. According to the town watchman's log, the cry was neither fully human nor recognizable as any local wildlife, a sustained note that began low and rose to a pitch that caused dogs throughout the town to howl in response. The official report of what they discovered has been subject to multiple revisions over the years, with the earliest version, filed on November 26, 1899, being substantially different from the amended report submitted to state authorities in January 1900. This discrepancy itself has become a subject of historical interest, with some researchers suggesting official pressure to rationalize events that defied conventional explanation. According to the original document recovered from Sheriff Donovan's personal files after his death in 1921, the men arrived at the mansion to find the front door standing open. The entryway floor was covered in a substance initially described as viscous and warm to the touch, with the consistency of phlegm. This description was amended in later reports to water damage from burst pipes. Deputy Foster's private journal is more explicit, describing this substance as translucent with amber undertones adhering to our boots and exhibiting movement seemingly independent of gravity, pooling upward along the walls rather than settling into recesses in the floorboards. The men proceeded through the ground floor, noting that the elaborate brackets securing furniture to the floor had been sheared off, with heavy pieces of furniture now positioned against the walls in a manner described as haphazard, as though moved by great force. More concerning was the state of the walls themselves. Deputy Foster's statement indicates that the previously papered walls now displayed a pattern of ridges beneath the surface that called to mind the muscular structure of a man's forearm. When one of the men, local blacksmith George Sullivan, attempted to examine these ridges more closely, he reportedly withdrew his hand with a shout, claiming the wall had felt unnaturally warm and yielding, with a subtle pulsation. As the group moved deeper into the mansion, they reportedly experienced difficulty breathing, with Sheriff Donovan noting that the air seemed to resist our passage, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. Sullivan, in a separate statement given to the Kansas City Star in 1902, described the sensation as walking through honey, each step requiring more effort than the last, as though the house itself resisted our intrusion. Particularly notable was the group's observation that despite the mansion's many windows, little external light penetrated the interior, creating what Donovan described as a premature twilight that seemed to emanate from the structure itself rather than resulting from an absence of illumination. On the grand staircase leading to the second floor, they discovered the first evidence that something terrible had befallen Thaddeus Blackwood, a trail of blood leading upward. Foster's journal notes that the blood appeared unusually viscous and dark, almost black in the poor light, and most disturbing. Where it had pooled on the wooden steps, the surrounding wood appeared to have absorbed it in patterns resembling capillaries, extending outward from each droplet. Following this trail, the men reached the second-floor landing, where the official report becomes notably clinical in its language, a stark contrast to the personal journals of Deputy Foster, discovered by his grandson in 1944. The official account states only that evidence of violence was observed throughout the second floor, with significant blood spatter consistent with a serious physical altercation. Foster's private writings, however, describe the scene in disturbing detail. The walls themselves seem to have turned on Blackwood. In places, the very structure of the house had formed protrusions, hard calcified growths that resembled bone more than wood or plaster. These growths were stained with blood and, in several locations, appeared to have pierced through furnishings as though the house had defended itself against some perceived threat. Most disturbing was Foster's description of the physical state of the house during their investigation. Throughout our time on the second floor, the structure seemed to respond to our presence. Doorways through which we had passed appeared narrower when we attempted to return through them. Floorboards audibly creaked, not under our weight, but in our wake, as though shifting after we had passed. When Sullivan set his lantern on a side table to assist with examining a particularly concerning growth on the ceiling, All four of us witnessed the surface of the table gradually tilt until the lantern slid off and shattered, though the table itself appeared perfectly level to the eye. Both accounts agree on what was found in the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Thaddeus Blackwood lay dead on the floor, his body positioned in a manner that suggested he had been fleeing toward the window. The cause of death, initially recorded as exsanguination from multiple puncture wounds, was later officially amended to accident resulting from structural collapse. The exact nature of these wounds is described in Dr. Holloway's medical examination, conducted at the scene rather than removing the body, as consistent with impalement on narrow, tapered objects that entered the body from multiple angles, primarily from behind. Holloway's report notes the curious observation that around each wound the victim's skin displayed discoloration in patterns similar to the grain of the surrounding wooden floor, as though the flesh were taking on the characteristics of the material that had penetrated it. Perhaps most disturbing was the state of the room itself. Foster's account describes how the walls surrounding the body displayed a pattern of protrusions and recesses that, when viewed collectively, created the unsettling impression of a crude handprint, as though a gigantic palm had pressed inward, driving the victim toward the center of the room. Sullivan, in his later statement to the press, put it more plainly. The room had shaped itself to trap him. According to Foster's journal, the floorboards beneath the corpse had somehow integrated with the victim's clothing and, in places, with the skin itself, requiring considerable force to separate. When finally freed, they discovered that the wood beneath had formed a shallow impression conforming exactly to Blackwood's body, not a mere indentation from weight, but a precisely molded form that appeared to have been deliberately shaped to cradle the corpse. What makes this case particularly notable is not just the unusual circumstances of Blackwood's death, but what was discovered in the subsequent search of the property. There's no other way to describe what we saw. The men's attempt to remove Blackwood's body for proper burial encountered unexpected resistance. In a hidden room accessible only through a concealed entrance in the library, authorities found an extensive collection of journals, anatomical drawings, and scientific equipment dating back to the 1860s. This laboratory space, not included in the mansion's original architectural plans, filed with the county, contained what Sheriff Donovan described as implements and apparatus whose purpose defies immediate identification, appearing to combine elements of medical, chemical, and architectural tools in configurations I have not previously encountered. These materials, most bearing the name Edmund Blackwood rather than Thaddeus, detailed experiments that defied conventional scientific understanding of the era. Edmund's journals described attempts to marry organic and inorganic matter at the cellular level, with particular focus on introducing living cellular structures into seemingly inert building materials. His theories, recorded across thousands of pages of dense text and intricate diagrams, proposed that the distinction between living tissue and so-called dead matter is not absolute, but rather a spectrum that can be navigated through proper application of specific catalysts and binding agents. The most disturbing entries, dated 1865-1867, detailed how Edmund had allegedly incorporated biological materials, including significant quantities of blood, tissue, and bone, into the very construction materials used to build the mansion. These journals suggested that the Civil War had provided ample resources for his work, with one entry obliquely referring to specimens harvested from fields where men no longer needed their mortal components. A ledger discovered among these papers indicated regular payments to an individual identified only as H for acquisition and transportation of necessary materials from battlefields throughout the region, with particularly large sums noted following major conflicts in the Western theater of the war. However, entries from 1867 indicate a breakthrough credited to the discovery of what he termed a binding catalyst of unprecedented efficacy following the acquisition of specimens displaying unusual regenerative properties. The nature of these specimens is not explicitly stated, though Edmund makes reference to subjects formerly diagnosed with particular resilience to conventional mortality. The journals grow increasingly erratic after this point, with Edmund describing unexpected autonomous behaviors in treated materials, including movement independent of applied force and apparent response to environmental stimuli. Most concerning are his observations of communication between disparate structural elements through means not readily apparent to visual inspection, suggesting that materials throughout the mansion were somehow sharing information or coordinating responses. Edmund's later entries suggest that his initial experiments yielded disappointing results, with organic components simply decaying within the construction materials rather than achieving the transcendent integration he sought. The scientific plausibility of such experiments has been debated by modern researchers, with most dismissing Edmund's work as the delusions of an unstable mind. However, samples taken from the mansion's structure before its demolition in 1901 showed anomalous properties that, according to a report filed by University of Missouri researchers and subsequently classified until 1962, contained cellular structures of indeterminate origin embedded within seemingly conventional building materials. Microscopic examination revealed what the report describes as fibrous networks resembling nervous tissue extending throughout samples of wood, stone, and mortar, creating a unified system that spans materially distinct components. Most disturbing was the observation that these samples, when maintained in appropriate conditions, exhibited measurable electrical activity consistent with basic cellular processes, despite being separated from the main structure for several weeks. One researcher noted that samples stored in proximity to one another appeared to establish connections across intervening space, with filament-like structures visibly extending between separated pieces. The researchers' final report included the ominous note that prolonged study of these materials is not recommended, as certain samples have displayed concerning adaptive behaviors, including apparent responses to stimuli that suggest rudimentary sensory capabilities. The study was abruptly terminated following an incident in which a researcher reportedly suffered unusual dermal adhesion when handling a sample with ungloved hands, requiring surgical intervention to separate the material from his skin. In the months following Thaddeus Blackwood's death, the mansion stood empty, with no heirs coming forward to claim the property. During this period, local authorities reported numerous issues with trespassers attempting to access the estate, drawn by growing rumors about its unusual properties. Sheriff Donovan established regular patrols of the grounds, though his records indicate that deputies increasingly requested reassignment to other duties, citing unspecified discomfort while on the property. The most credible of these accounts comes from Reverend Michael Townsend of the First Baptist Church of Mound City, who, along with 2 church elders, visited the property in February 1900 to assess its potential for conversion into a sanatorium. His written report to the church board, preserved in their meeting minutes, describes how the group observed definite movement within the walls, subtle but unmistakable, like the gentle rise and fall of a sleeping person's chest. Reverend Townsend, described by contemporaries as methodical and not prone to exaggeration, detailed how the group conducted a simple experiment to verify their observations. We placed a glass of water on the mantelpiece in the main parlor and observed its surface over a period of approximately 20 minutes. The liquid displayed regular disturbances, concentric ripples appearing at intervals of roughly 1 minute, consistent with subtle but regular movement of the structure. No external causes, such as passing vehicles or wind, could account for this phenomenon. More alarming was their discovery that interior doors, which had stood open during their initial walkthrough, were found closed upon their attempt to exit, despite no draft or other explanation for the movement. Reverend Townsend's account concludes with the observation that, as they departed, a sound followed us down the drive, not footsteps, but rather the impression of a body dragging itself across wooden floors, accompanied by what I can only describe as labored breathing emanating from the very structure itself. The church board unanimously rejected the proposal to acquire the property, with the minutes recording their decision that the location is unsuitable for purposes of healing or spiritual renewal due to unspecified but significant concerns regarding the structural integrity and general atmosphere of the estate. Privately, Reverend Townsend advised his congregation to avoid the property entirely, a recommendation that contributed to growing local sentiment that the mansion should be demolished. In a personal letter to his brother in St. Louis, discovered during a 1957 estate sale, Townsend was more forthright. "I cannot shake the conviction that what occupies the Blackwood property is neither fully structural nor properly inanimate. During our brief visit, I experienced an overwhelming sense of being observed not by any visible presence, but by the house itself. Most disturbing was the moment of our departure when I distinctly felt a pressure against my back, as though the threshold were attempting to prevent my exit." Harrison, one of the church elders, later confided that he experienced the same sensation, along with an overwhelming urge to return inside, an impulse he described as not his own. During this period, unusual phenomena were reported in the vicinity of the estate. Birds were conspicuously absent from the immediate area, creating what one observer described as a sphere of unnatural silence surrounding the house. Most concerning were reports from the Mercer farm that plants growing near the property line displayed unusual characteristics, unnatural rates of growth, and structures inconsistent with their species, including what Jonathan Mercer described as woody vines that seemed to deliberately orient themselves toward the mansion, regardless of available sunlight. The fate of the Blackwood estate was ultimately determined not by supernatural concerns, but mundane politics. Farmers with land adjacent to the property noted that animals refused to graze within 100 yards of the mansion's boundaries. In March 1900, the county board declared the property abandoned and ordered its demolition, citing safety concerns. However, historical records indicate the unusual difficulty experienced by the demolition crew tasked with raising the structure. According to work logs from the Gilbert Construction Company, contracted for the demolition, standard equipment proved unusually ineffective against the structure. Saws would dull after minimal use, and in several documented instances, workers reported that portions of the building appeared to heal overnight, with fresh materials seemingly regenerating in areas that had been removed the previous day. Foreman Richard Gilbert's daily reports document the crew's growing unease with the project. An entry from April 7th notes, "Men complaining of unusual fatigue beyond what the physical demands of the work would justify." 3 workers reported identical symptoms: pressure in the chest, difficulty breathing, and a persistent sensation of being watched. By April 10th, the situation had deteriorated further, work progressing at approximately 40% of expected rate. Materials display unprecedented resistance to conventional tools. Of particular concern are the support beams in the east wing, which 4 men with saws were unable to sever after a full day's effort. Most troubling was Gilbert's observation that segments of the structure already removed and stacked for disposal appeared to have established connections with the surrounding soil. Root-like protrusions observed extending from wooden beams into the ground overnight. When extracted, these roots display an internal structure inconsistent with normal wood grain, more closely resembling vascular tissue. The foreman's logs, maintained in the Missouri State Archives, note that workers refused to continue after an incident on April 12, 1900, when a section of wall being dismantled allegedly contracted suddenly, trapping and crushing the right hand of worker Samuel Davis. Davis survived but lost 3 fingers, according to medical records from St. Joseph Hospital. His attending physician, Dr. William Morris, noted in his report the unusual nature of the injury. The affected tissue displays abnormal characteristics inconsistent with typical crush injuries. Specifically, the remaining portions of the damaged fingers exhibit a wood-like grain pattern extending beneath the skin, as though the foreign material and patient's tissue had undergone some form of integration. Even more disturbing was Dr. Morris's observation that small splinters embedded in Davis's palm appeared to move independently when observed under magnification, suggesting either an unusual parasitic infestation or some property of the material itself that defies current medical understanding. These splinters were removed and preserved in alcohol, but according to hospital records, the specimens disappeared from the laboratory 3 days later under unexplained circumstances. Following the Davis incident, Gilbert Construction withdrew from the contract, forfeiting a substantial completion bond rather than continuing the work. In his final report to the county board, Foreman Gilbert stated bluntly, "No conventional demolition approach appears effective against this structure. Furthermore, I cannot in good conscience continue to expose workers to what I have come to believe is an active threat, rather than passive structural resistance." The county commissioners, faced with mounting public pressure to remove what was increasingly viewed as a dangerous curiosity attracting unwanted attention to Mound City, approved extraordinary measures. Captain Hargrove's approach, detailed in his correspondence with the county board, involved the use of explosives placed at key structural points, a method he described as excessive for conventional demolition but necessary given the unusual resilience of the materials. His initial assessment of the property, conducted on May 3rd, contains several concerning observations, including his note that the structure displays characteristics more consistent with a biological entity than an architectural construction, and that certain areas of the mansion appear to have developed structural elements with no clear purpose from a design perspective, analogous to vestigial organs in evolutionary biology. The demolition was eventually completed only after county authorities approved the use of explosives, an extreme and costly measure for the time. Even then, workers reported that fragments of the mansion seemed to exhibit unusual properties, with one worker claiming in a sworn statement that pieces of wood and stone seemed to move of their own accord when collected in piles, attempting to reassemble themselves. This statement, provided by laborer Thomas Wilson and notarized on May 17, 1900, describes how smaller fragments would migrate overnight toward larger pieces, creating arrangements reminiscent of the original structure on a miniature scale. Captain Hargrove's final report includes the recommendation that all materials from the structure should be thoroughly destroyed rather than merely dispersed, citing concerns that the unusual properties observed may persist in separated components with potential for continued development if permitted to remain intact. He specifically warned against allowing any materials to be salvaged or repurposed, noting that contamination of other structures with these components could lead to transmission of the anomalous characteristics. Following the complete demolition, the county ordered the remains to be buried in a large pit dug on the property and covered with lime before being filled in, a method more commonly associated with disposing of diseased livestock than building materials. Records indicate that on April 28, 1900, they contracted with a military demolitions expert, Captain James Hargrove, who had served with the Corps of Engineers during the Spanish-American War. The property was then declared uninhabitable by county ordinance, a designation that remained in effect until 1957. Captain Hargrove personally supervised this burial, insisting on a pit depth of at least 20 feet, far deeper than would be necessary for conventional disposal, and the application of nearly 2 tons of quicklime, an expense that prompted considerable debate among the county commissioners. In a private letter to his former commanding officer, discovered during research for a military history of the Spanish-American War in 1958, Hargrove expressed concerns not included in his official report. "What we encountered at Mound City defies rational explanation within our current scientific framework. The structure exhibited behaviors consistent with a living organism rather than inert materials. Most disturbing was the apparent coordination between physically separated components, suggesting a unified awareness that persisted despite dismantling of the visible structure. I cannot shake the conviction that what we buried was not truly destroyed but merely contained, and that containment may prove temporary. The legacy of the Blackwood estate did not end with its physical destruction. In the decades that followed, multiple accounts emerged of unusual phenomena associated with the property. Farmers working adjacent fields reported crops growing in unusual patterns over the burial site, forming what some described as vein-like structures when viewed from elevated positions. Aerial photographs taken during a county land survey in 1927, preserved in the state archives, showed distinctive vegetation patterns radiating outward from the former mansion site, arrangements too regular to be natural, but not consistent with any known agricultural practice. Local wildlife exhibited unusual behaviors near the property as well. Hunters reported that deer and other game animals gave the area a wide berth, creating what one 1912 account described as an unnatural dead zone where no creature willingly treads. Birds were observed flying around rather than over the property, even when doing so required considerable deviation from their normal routes. Most disturbing were reports from 1919 that a pack of feral dogs that had been troubling local farms was found dead at the perimeter of the property, arranged in a precise circle around the burial site, with no visible cause of death. In 1932, during the construction of a county road that passed near the former estate, workers uncovered what was initially identified as a fossilized tree root, but was later described by a visiting geologist from Washington University as organic material of indeterminate origin, with a cellular structure resembling neither plant nor animal tissue, but possessing characteristics of both. Dr. Harold Fleming's analysis, published in an obscure geological journal before being withdrawn from circulation under unclear circumstances, described the specimen as displaying a complex internal structure incorporating both mineralized components typical of geological formations and organized cellular arrangements more commonly associated with biological entities. Most concerning was Dr. Fleming's observation that the specimen appeared to undergo subtle changes during the examination period, with measurable alterations in density and microscopic structure occurring without apparent external cause. His report recommends extreme caution in handling similar materials, particularly given the specimen's apparent capacity for adaptation to laboratory conditions. Following the publication of this analysis, the specimen was allegedly transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, but no record of its arrival or subsequent research exists in publicly available archives. Perhaps most significant is the report filed by Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a biologist who examined soil samples from the property in 1958 as part of a broader agricultural study. Her findings, published in an obscure academic journal before being retracted under pressure from the university, suggested that the soil contained multicellular organisms that appear to incorporate both organic compounds and inorganic building materials within their structure, an observation strikingly similar to those recorded in Edmund Blackwood's journals nearly a century earlier. Dr. Hayes's report includes microscopic photographs of these organisms, described as filament-like structures with a crystalline outer layer surrounding a core of what appears to be modified cellular material. Most disturbing was her observation that when multiple samples were maintained in close proximity, the filaments oriented themselves toward neighboring specimens and, in several documented cases, established physical connections between previously separate samples. Her conclusion, omitted from later versions of the report, but preserved in her personal research notes acquired by the Missouri Historical Society in 1972, states that the material appears to retain some form of environmental awareness and displays behaviors consistent with a colonial organism seeking to reestablish a larger network. The university's decision to pressure Dr. Hayes to withdraw her findings coincided with a visit from individuals identifying themselves as representatives of the Department of Defense, according to her personal correspondence. In a letter to a colleague dated September 1958, she wrote, "Two men visited my laboratory yesterday, asking detailed questions about the Blackwood property samples and requesting all materials related to the study. They presented credentials indicating a connection to a military research division, though they declined to specify the nature of their interest. I was instructed in no uncertain terms to cease all work with these samples and to make no further public statements regarding my observations. The most recent documented investigation of the property occurred in 1968, when a team from the University of Missouri's Department of Anthropology conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site as part of a study on 19th-century building foundations. Robert Chambers described as a network of structures beneath the soil that resemble a circulatory system more than conventional foundations. According to the team's preliminary report, these subterranean structures extended well beyond the known boundaries of the original mansion, suggesting either extensive, undocumented construction or expansion of the subsurface elements after the building's demolition. Of particular concern was their observation that these structures appeared to be arranged in patterns inconsistent with any known architectural purpose, but bearing striking similarities to biological transport networks such as vascular or neural systems. Most disturbing was the team's discovery that the burial pit, created in 1900, appeared to be significantly diminished in both depth and volume compared to historical records, suggesting either incomplete documentation of the original excavation or subsequent movement of the interred materials. Their survey indicated that the densest concentration of subsurface anomalies radiated outward from this pit in patterns suggesting deliberate expansion rather than random dispersal. Doctor, their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, but the partial data they collected showed what team leader Dr. Chambers and his team were denied funding for further investigation, and the university subsequently classified their preliminary findings. In a private letter to a colleague discovered after his death in 1976, Chambers wrote, "What we found at the Blackwood site defies conventional explanation. The underground structures appear to be expanding year by year like roots seeking water. But more disturbing is their pattern, not random growth, but deliberate, organized development. Whatever is beneath that soil, I am increasingly convinced it is not merely remnants of the mansion. It is something that continues to grow, to adapt, and perhaps most terrifying of all, to plan." This letter, along with much of the documentation related to the Blackwood case, might have remained hidden in private collections and sealed archives had it not been for the efforts of investigative journalist Michael Lehman. In 1962, Lehman began researching what he initially believed would be a simple article on unusual local legends for the St. Joseph Gazette. His investigation quickly expanded as he uncovered the extensive, though fragmented, documentation surrounding the Blackwood estate. Lehman's notes, preserved in the newspaper's archives following his unexpected retirement in 1963, detail his growing conviction that the Blackwood case represents something far more significant than a curious historical footnote or colorful local superstition. His research methodology was meticulous, cross-referencing multiple sources and seeking out individuals with direct connections to the events, an increasingly difficult task as the incidents receded into history. Among Lehman's most valuable discoveries was Sarah Donovan, Sheriff William Donovan's daughter, who granted him access to her father's personal journals and correspondence. These documents, which Lehman described as remarkably forthright compared to the sanitized official records, included the sheriff's private reflections on the Blackwood case, reflections that grew increasingly troubled in the years following the mansion's demolition. In an entry dated November 1909, a decade after the events, Donovan wrote, "I dream of the house still, not as it was, but as it might have become had we not intervened. In these dreams, it has grown beyond all reasonable bounds, extending outward to engulf neighboring properties, its walls rippling with visible musculature, windows blinking like eyes as they track movement across the landscape. I wake convinced that what we buried did not die, but merely sleeps, gathering strength for some future emergence. Lehman's investigation took an unexpected turn when he attempted to access county records related to the property's status following the demolition. According to his notes, he encountered surprising resistance from officials who seemed unusually concerned about inquiries into a century-old case. When he finally gained access to the relevant documents, he discovered that the property had been subject to unusual legal restrictions, including a prohibition against any excavation deeper than 3 feet without special permits that required approval from both county and state authorities. Most intriguing was Lehman's discovery that the property had been quietly purchased by a federal government entity in 1951, operating through a series of shell corporations that obscured the ultimate ownership. His attempts to identify the specific agency involved were unsuccessful, though he noted that the transaction coincided with increased military interest in unconventional research following the outbreak of the Korean War. Lehman's investigation came to an abrupt end in December 1963 when he informed his editor that he was taking an indefinite leave of absence for health reasons. According to colleagues, this decision followed a visit to the Blackwood site, after which Lehman appeared uncharacteristically agitated and reluctant to discuss his findings. His notes from this visit, the final entry in his research journal, contain only the cryptic observation: "It persists beneath the surface, but perceptible to those who know what to observe." The patterns in the soil, the unusual thermal variations, the absence of normal insect activity, all point to continued metabolic processes on a scale that defies comprehension. Most disturbing was the distinct impression that it responded to my presence, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the immediate environment when I approached the center of the property, as though something vast and patient had taken notice of my arrival. Today, the former site of the Blackwood estate remains undeveloped, marked only by a simple fence, with no historical marker or acknowledgement of what once stood there. Local ordinances still prohibit construction on the property, citing unstable ground conditions rather than the property's disturbing history. Satellite imagery shows the location as an unusually uniform clearing in the otherwise developed landscape surrounding Mound City, a perfect rectangle of undisturbed land that corresponds exactly to the original property boundaries established by Edmund Blackwood in 1860. Occasional reports still emerge from those who venture too close to the perimeter, accounts of unusual sounds described as deep rhythmic pulses like a massive heartbeat emanating from beneath the soil. These reports are generally dismissed by authorities as the product of overactive imaginations, influenced by local legends. Environmental surveys conducted in the area consistently show unexplained temperature variations, with the property maintaining a constant temperature approximately 2 degrees warmer than surrounding land regardless of seasonal conditions, a phenomenon attributed to unusual geothermal properties in official reports. Yet one final piece of evidence suggests that whatever began in the Blackwood mansion may not have ended with its destruction. County water management surveys conducted in 1965 revealed an unusual pattern of groundwater movement in the area, flowing not according to the natural topography of the land, but rather in circular patterns centered on the former mansion site, as though being drawn toward some central point beneath the earth. Subsequent studies have documented a gradual but measurable depletion of certain mineral compounds in soil samples taken at increasing distances from the property, creating what geologists have termed a nutritional gradient consistent with systematic extraction by an unknown process. Perhaps most telling is the fact that in 1972, an unmarked federal facility, was constructed approximately 1 mile from the Blackwood site, a small compound described in county records as an agricultural research station, but featuring security measures disproportionate to such a mundane purpose. Local residents report regular movement of specialized equipment between this facility and the Blackwood property, particularly during overnight hours, though no official acknowledgement of these activities appears in public records. As one elderly resident of Mound City told a researcher in 1962 in what would be the last documented interview regarding the Blackwood case, "Some things don't die when you tear them down. The Blackwood place wasn't just a house that went bad or went strange. It was something else altogether, something that learned how to wear the shape of a house, like you or I might wear a coat. And I believe it's still there, under the ground, just waiting, growing, spreading its roots, biding its time." This resident, identified in research notes only as Mrs. L., claimed to be the granddaughter of a worker who had participated in the mansion's demolition. Her final comments, recorded but omitted from the published account, add a disturbing coda to the historical record. "My grandfather told me something before he died, something he never told another soul. He said that as they were burying the last of the mansion's remains, he saw something that haunted him till his dying day." A piece of what looked like ordinary floorboard suddenly split open like a seed pod, revealing what he described as something like a tiny malformed hand reaching upward before they could cover it with lime. Whatever Edmund Blackwood created in that house, my grandfather believed it wasn't just alive, it was trying to evolve. Modern science offers no framework to explain the events at the Blackwood estate. Contemporary researchers examining the fragmentary evidence typically attribute the accounts to a combination of misunderstanding, exaggeration, and the human tendency to impose narrative on coincidental events. The unusual material properties reported in various examinations are dismissed as contamination, experimental error, or deliberate falsification for publicity or academic advancement. Yet the property remains empty, the federal presence continues without explanation, and locals still refuse to approach the site after dusk. Longtime residents of Mound City maintain an unspoken agreement not to discuss the Blackwood matter with outsiders, though they teach their children to give the property a wide berth, a cultural memory preserved through generations without official acknowledgement. Whether the Blackwood mansion was indeed something more than mere structure and material, whether it achieved some impossible synthesis of life and architecture through Edmund Blackwood's macabre experiments, remains a question without definitive answer. The records are fragmentary, contradictory, and in many cases suspiciously altered or destroyed. Those who have investigated most deeply have often abandoned their research under circumstances that themselves raise troubling questions. What cannot be disputed is that in the autumn of 1899, something occurred at the Blackwood estate that defied conventional explanation, something that left a lasting mark not just on local history, but on the very land itself. And perhaps, if the more disturbing accounts are to be believed, something that continues to this day, pulsing slowly beneath the soil of Holt County, Missouri, patient, adaptive, and eternally alive. In the words of Thaddeus Blackwood's final journal entry, found clutched in his hand at the time of his death, "I now understand what Uncle Edmund sought to create, not merely a living structure, but a new form of existence that transcends the boundaries between the animate and inanimate. He succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions, though he did not live to witness the full fruition of his work. The house is not merely alive, it is becoming something for which we have no name. God help those who come after, for what sleeps beneath these floors dreams of a world remade in its image." These words, omitted from all official reports and known only through a private transcription made by Sheriff Donovan before surrendering the document to county authorities, serve as a final warning from beyond the grave, a testimony to human ambition overreaching its understanding, and to the possibility that some boundaries exist not to be overcome, but to protect us from what lies beyond. And I fear it has developed appetites consistent with its nature, to consume, to convert, to expand.